If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, people who have seen or heard stories of encounters with folklore, mythical creatures, legends, ancient evil, or any scary stories from where you live. What was it? One night around midnight, someone drunk gets on a bus and falls asleep on his seat. There are about a dozen people inside the bus. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then the drunk wakes up to an old guy getting on the bus. The old guy looks around the bus and chooses to sit next to the drunk. The drunk is a bit annoyed but doesn't think too much of it. He then drifts off again. Suddenly, he wakes up again to find the old guy grabbing his collar and shaking him violently. The old guy yells at him, "Little ducker pretended to be asleep and tried to steal my wallet." Of course, he does not do such things. So he defends himself, "No, I didn't. I was drunk and sleeping, you crazy old man." They cause too much ruckus, so in the end, the driver has to throw them both off the bus. As soon as they get off, the guy immediately lashes out. Yet the old man holds up his hand and stops him. "I just saved both of our lives, young man," he says. "You were too drunk to notice." None of the other passengers had feet. El Sibon. The Whistler is a folklore monster from South America that tracks down people and lures them away with a distinctive whistle. Earlier last year, I went hiking with a friend at night, maybe around 10 p.m., on a trail in the PNW of Washington, and this experience was brought up again, and I was hoping for some insight or answers. Around the peak of our nighttime hike, around 11:30 or midnight, while we were at the tallest point of the trail, things started to take a strange turn. We heard rustling in the trees and bushes nearby, but it was pretty flat at the top of the trail, so visibility was okay, so we just thought it was an animal, but then the animal started to whistle, and it started to get louder and louder and closer. We did not stay to find out what it was, and we promptly left, running away and cutting through many private properties to get away from whatever whistling was chasing us away. These are private trails, and it was late at night, and where it started, as I stated before, it was pretty flat, so our visibility was okay, yet we couldn't see any beings of any sort, just the approach of inhuman whistling. The church in my village, Ireland, was supposedly built on the ruins of some kind of ancient pagan site where some fairly ducked-up rituals had taken place. Including, legend has it, the sacrifice of children. That's probably bullshit. I don't think the pagan rituals involve that kind of crap. But some of the old folk here swear it's true. Anyway, there is genuinely a very weird vibe in the church. You walk in there, and your hair stands on end. It's like the place is humming with static electricity. Sometimes, during Mass, the lights will start to flicker, or the priest's microphone will turn itself off and on again in rapid succession. The strange thing about that is that it only ever happens during the part of the Mass where he holds the communion up and says "Body of Christ." He's had a couple of electricians in to check the wiring, but they've both said it's in good shape. Oh, and you can't bring a baby into the church during Mass, they go berserk, and not just the normal crying, real screaming, pure terror. Or pain. I've heard it, it's not nice. There's also a cool urban, village legend attached to the church. It goes like this. One morning, around about Easter 1890, a young woman called Margaret Canane walked into the church with her newborn baby, who was to be baptized in secret. The secrecy was because the child had been born out of wedlock, which was a major problem back then. Ordinarily, no priest would baptize a bastard child, leaving its soul tainted with sin, etc. The old priest at the time, however, had a reputation as a kind man and had agreed with Margaret that he would baptize her son if she brought him before sunrise when he could perform the ritual in secret. When she brought the child to the baptism font, the priest was already there, dressed in robes and with a hood over his head. He quietly reached out for the child and proceeded to dip the boy's head in the holy water. Just then the church door opened, and Margaret looked around in fright, expecting to be confronted by angry villagers because of the illegal baptism. To her amazement, the old priest was standing in the doorway. He took one look at her and the figure behind her, opened his mouth to shout something, and fell down dead. Margaret turned back to the baptism font to take her child from the impostor's arms, but there was no one there, only the dead body of her son, drowned in the holy water. They say her screams could be heard in the next parish, 5 miles away. Only a legend, I know, but there's no baptismal font in the church. It's the only church in the county without one. And infants always cry in that church. Icelander here, we've got elves living in our rocks, and if you try to destroy their cities by building roads or houses on top of them, they will first let you off with a warning by destroying your machinery, and if you don't stop, they will take you to the elves' world and make you into slaves or even kill you. If you piss them off in another way, they can drag you into the elves' world as well or kill you. They are invisible to humans unless they want you to see them all year around, except for June 24th. If you happen to be at a crossroads when it turns midnight, an elf in the form of the prettiest woman, or man, depending on what you are into, will come to you and offer gold, love, and everything else good that you can think of. If you accept it, it will be your last day alive. However, if you resist refusing everything throughout the night, you will wake up with wealth beyond measure and find your perfect person to love and spend the rest of your life with. And we also got trolls, ghosts, and mermaids. Australians here, 2 legends I can think of. Minute Min lights, not so much a legend as an observed but unidentified phenomenon. Basically, at night in the vast, flat plains of the outback, lights can be seen near the horizon. They appear to be floating and move away or disappear when approached. Sighting stories appear in both Aboriginal folklore and post-European settlements. The other is more of a story I heard regarding a region in northern NSW. Basically, there is a big pile of granite boulders. Well, they look like stacked boulders, but in reality, it's an old igneous intrusion that has been exposed. Erosion has caused huge voids and vugs to form, some extending deep into the mound. Local Aboriginal legend says that it is where spirits live, and voices can be heard coming from within, calling people to investigate and climb the mound. The legend comes with a warning that you should not listen to the voice, as you'll disappear and never be seen again. Locals believe people who do explore and climb the mound fall into the voids and can't get out, dying inside and joining the chorus of voices. Here in Brazil, we have the Curupira, or, in a well-known Indian language, the demon of the forest. Since Brazilian folklore tends to be remodeled so kids can learn about it without fearing it, the Curupira has many appearances, but according to said Indian tribe, the Curupira has a human body covered in red fur, green teeth, and its feet turned to its back. It is known to kill and confuse hunters or whoever tries to harm wildlife. The footprint it leaves makes anyone who tries to follow it get lost in the rainforest. On the 23rd of December, the day before the biggest day of Christmas, this is Scandinavia, we are the reason Christmas is a thing. Big J was born in August or something, and the original holiday was just a few days right after the winter solstice. One would do well not to be alone. One famous story is that, a long time ago, the family and serfs were going to a several-day celebration in the household one day over. A girl was chosen to stay at home and watch the house and the livestock, but was directed not to leave for any reason on the 23rd. She did as was told, managing what she was supposed to, but in the evening of the 23rd, Thorlaksmessa, she started seeing lights in the courtyard. There was beautiful singing, and she could see through the hazy glass that there was dancing and a bountiful banquet. There are people outside beseeching her to come join them. After all, her real family had left her to rot while they made merry. So eventually she did. She left her house and partook in the fun, ate the food, and drank the drinks. When her family returned on the 24th, the girl was nowhere to be seen, taken by the elves. La Lechusa, a witch can turn into an owl and sound like a baby crying. Legend says the witch was very clever and would always look for a home that had a newborn in it. When it would find a house, the Lechusa would wait until nighttime and make the sound of a baby crying, distracting the mother from thinking a baby was outside. While the parents would be distracted looking for this crying baby, the Lechusa would climb through the window, snatch the newborn, and eat it, only leaving bits and pieces of the baby for the mother and father to find. Now if the witch was really hungry, it would wait until dusk and make a whistling sound instead of tricking small children to go outside. Once outside, the small child would be carried away and never seen again. My cousins and I have actually heard the whistling of the Lechusa many times, and we were always warned to be indoors if there was no light outside. My grandmother would tell us that the moment we heard that whistling, that would be the last thing we would hear before we got eaten. When I was 7, I woke up in the middle of the night to steal some biscuits or sweets from the kitchen. Our kitchen is right beside our conservatory, which has big open windows that allow you to glance into the garden. While eating, I heard some chatter from outside. Curious, I went to peer outside the window. I saw 3 little men in red pointy hats outside in my garden, bickering amongst themselves in a strange language I've never heard before or after. I was so stricken with terror that I dared not speak. I ran to my parents' bedroom to tell them about our intruders. My dad was reluctant to believe me, but he could see I was obviously shaken up by something and came down the stairs to investigate. They must have heard us coming because by the time we'd gotten to the conservatory, they'd already pegged it and were running through the back gate. My dad caught a glimpse of them too, but he only saw their pointy red hats. I've never seen him look so scared before or in complete disbelief. Here's one from my town of Formby, UK. Old Trash is the phantom black dog that haunts the sand dunes around the Formby coast. I've never seen it personally, but it allegedly comes from Viking lore that Viking marauders who attacked the coast would often wear the pelts of wolves to imitate their spirits, and upon death, their souls would take the shape of a black dog or a black wolf that would roam the coast. Formby has a long Viking history, which probably accounts for the long-standing myth of the black wolf. I live in the same town as the famous demonologist, Lorraine Warren. I used to see her out and about quite a bit, but not so much anymore. The White Lady ghost is rumored to be haunting a local cemetery, but I've never seen her. Also, the infamous Annabelle doll is in her home museum of haunted objects. Legend goes that she had some students at her home for a tour way back in the early 80s, and supposedly, after seeing Annabelle, a kid dared the doll to do something, but nothing happened. He mocked the doll and then headed home on his bike. He was decapitated on the way home in an accident. Her nephew, John Zaffis, lives a few towns over and is my friend's dad's neighbor. He also has a haunted museum. He had a show called Haunted Collector. I thought it was one of the better paranormal shows. So, yeah, this is pretty much how I've come to be such a paranormal fanatic. As a matter of fact, what initially drew me in was a live television broadcast of an exorcism by a local news channel back in the 90s. It was performed in the church next door to the haunted cemetery, with the white ghost. The Warrens were there. It was terrifying, and I've been hooked ever since. I can't get enough. I saw a will-o-wisp. Do myths have a grain of truth? I was just telling my crazy little story when I saw a ghost orb, or maybe a will-o-wisp, when I was a teenager with my family. To this day, we all still remember it and have no idea what it was. So my family and I came home from the movies one day. As we were about to head inside, we were stopped by my sister, still back at the car, telling us to look. About 25 yards away on our street, we saw a blue orb. However, this wasn't some silly little blob in a photo or a faint light in the distance. This was a bright, shining orb, a little larger than a basketball, floating down our street. At first, through the brush at the edge of our property, we thought it was just a motorcycle moving slowly. But when it came in front of our driveway, there was no mistake. It was so inspiring that all we could do was watch this thing slowly creep down our street. On closer inspection, it almost seemed like the light inside was moving around or undulating. We watched it until it headed toward the woods and disappeared. This was such a surreal thing that after we all headed inside, we never talked about it until years later. I remember being upset that I didn't go after it and try to touch it. That's how real and solid this thing looked, almost like a floating crystal ball with a blue light in the center. There is a story about our road being patrolled by a Native American chief who was buried in the area. Maybe that was him? In hindsight, I don't think I would have been able to move if I wanted to. Maybe it was fear, but I remember being so awestruck that it was like I was frozen in time. So for the last few years now, on seemingly random nights, I have seen a woman on a small bridge outside my neighborhood. She's always either standing upright or crawling on all fours. One time, she appeared standing up in front of my truck. I nearly went off the road. This isn't the first time I've seen something that is apparently paranormal by any means, so I never thought too much of it. But a friend of mine is dating a woman of Native American descent, and when I told them about the woman, her eyes went wide, and she said, in a paralyzing voice, "Have you ever seen her face?" When I asked for clarification, she basically screamed the same question at me. I told her no, saying that she was never looking directly at me. She said, "Do not ever stop for her or let her into your vehicle." She said it was so intense that I got chills all over my body. When I asked her why, she told me a story of a supernatural being believed in by her tribe, the name of which escapes me now. This being appeared in human form, often as the opposite sex of who it appeared to be, but would never show its face. The reason it never showed its face is because it has no face. Its lack of face is representative of the being's lack of identity, an identity that it seeks to steal from its victims. From what I could gather, this was a being that sought to possess people. Is anyone aware of such folklore? I'd be interested to hear similar stories. My experience with a Menehune. This happened in January. I live on Oahu, and by my house there is a lei on a tree branch that looks like it hasn't been touched in ages. One day I caught my dog nearly touching one of the leis before I got him. However, the lei still broke. Later that night, I usually listen to soft rock music to go to sleep. I was listening to Penny Lane by the Beatles, and about 15 seconds into the song, I started hearing an echoey female ghost-like voice singing to the music that sounded like the mythical Menehune. I tried my best to locate the singing while in shock at what was happening, and I came to the conclusion that it was coming from the tree branch with leis. After the song was over, it faded away. In Hawaiian mythology, the Menehune are said to be a people, sometimes described as dwarfs in size, who live in the deep forests and hidden valleys of the Hawaiian Islands, far from the eyes of normal humans. Their favorite food is banana, and they also like fish. The Menehune were said to be superb craftspeople. Legends say that the Menehune built temples, heiau, fish ponds, roads, canoes, and houses. Some of these structures that Hawaiian folklore attributed to the Menehune still exist. They are said to have lived in Hawaii before settlers arrived from Polynesia many centuries ago. This is a creepy experience I had while working on a farm in a remote part of southern Trinidad, right on the coast, with Venezuela's Amazon rainforests across the water. One night, some neighbors were hanging out in our common room, chatting about anything and everything. The topic of the paranormal came up, and one man said that a couple nights ago, he had seen a large orange fireball rise out of the ground of the local cricket pitch and fly away in the sky. "Wow," I said. "Sounds like you saw a UFO. I'm Canadian and didn't know about the local folklore." "That was no UFO," he said, "that was a sokaunia." "What's that?" I asked. He proceeded to explain what this creature was, and everyone else in the room solemnly agreed. It was some of the most far-fetched stuff I'd ever heard, but the atmosphere was dead serious. He told me that a sokaunia is a witch, an old crone who lives in the jungle or on the outskirts of towns. These women have created a pact with a dark entity that allows them to have very prolonged lifespans. The way they maintain their lives for so many years is vampirism. They enter people's homes at night, invisible, and suck their blood. They shed their skin, become fireballs, and fly around. They can enter people's homes through a space as small as a keyhole. The only way to kill them is by tracking down the location where the old woman left her skin during the night and throwing salt on her skin. As you can imagine, this was pretty damn trippy to hear. It gave me the creeps, especially because multiple people in the room shared their own very personal experiences with the witch, including one guy whose wife had her blood sucked while in bed with him. Apparently she woke up pale and blue, and she had human-sized bite marks all over her body. It took weeks for her to regain her strength. Freaky. Here's where it gets freakier. A couple nights later, I was sleeping in my cinderblock bedroom. I'm dreaming, and all of a sudden my dream becomes very sharp, very focused, and very real. I see my own body sleeping. I look up through the ceiling and see that above the house, a fireball has just flown in. I sense a terrifying power from this fireball, and I feel this witch looking at me, wondering whether to strike. I try to wake myself up desperately as this fireball contemplates whether to enter the house and suck my blood. She wants me. Just as she's about to fly in, her attention shifts violently to the corner of my room. She focuses on a small black and white stone egg that my mother gave me for good luck while traveling. That egg breaks her thirst for me, and she flies away. The second she takes her attention off my room, I wake up screaming in a cold sweat. In other words, the stone egg protected me. It's a wild story, and maybe it was all in my head, but it felt incredibly real. I remember reading in Central and Eastern European folklore that there used to be a very firm and widespread belief in real vampires. It was so widely believed that some people desecrated corpses in order to prevent them from becoming vampires. Fortunately, these seem to have mostly stopped, with some exceptions here and there, like the incident in Romania last year where some people ate a corpse's heart because they thought it became a vampire. There's a lot of other strange stuff that goes along with Slavic vampire lore that contradicts Hollywood vampire lore on many levels. For example, in Slavic lore, werewolves and vampires are actually the same creature, and they're the dead rising from the grave, not an infection or curse on a living person. What do you think? Do you think these creatures are real, and if so, is medieval lore about them more accurate than Hollywood lore? Cryptozoology is the study of unknown animals and plants that have not yet been accepted by science to exist or be real. In some cases, cryptozoologists researched accounts involving large carnivorous plants consuming animals and even human beings. What would one do if encountering a tree starving for human blood spawned not from nature but by supernatural forces? In Japan, legends warn of a vampiric plant called the Jubac. Japanese folklore labels demons, monsters, spirits, and other malevolent forces as yokai. A few of these supernatural entities resulted in a human, animal, or even household transforming after experiencing some traumatic or violent event. It is not surprising to discover legends about plants manifesting into yokai that feed upon humans, like the Jubac. In myth, this creature was once a tree within a battlefield whose roots absorbed vast amounts of blood soaked in the soil from dead warriors, giving birth to a monster. Jubac appears as any other ordinary tree in the forest, waiting for an unsuspecting victim. Only the observant may be warned by the usual jagged branches or the several bones poking through the roots. Many fail to notice these features and fall victim to trees once they are close enough. The branches would grab the prey and hoist them up to the center of the tree. The victim would have their veins and arteries stabbed by the branches as Jubac sucked out all the blood. The corpse would either remain hanging or be lowered to the ground for animals and other scavengers to feed on until bones littered the roots. Often, Jubac thirsts for human blood but will consume large animals when people are not around. Many Japanese legends of yokai will refer to ways of defeating them. Jubac may be a demon, but it still has the same vulnerabilities as a plant. Some stories told of chopping the tree down while fighting off its branches or setting fire to it until ashes remained. Just a note, myths mention that a Jubac branch can heal wounds and cure illnesses. This happened to me when I was approximately 7 or 9 years old, but I'm unable to forget that memory. It happened at night. I was sleeping on my bed, alone, and I felt something calling me from the big window that was in front of my bed. I can't remember if the calling was just my name. I just remember hearing the sound and innocently opening the curtain and seeing outside. There was a dwarf looking at me. I say it's a dwarf because I can't say what the hell it was. It was a short woman, her skin was very white but almost greenish. She had long fingers, and she was wearing bad clothes, but I remember she was wearing a long and dirty red skirt. She was pointing at me and asking me to go outside. She was very insistent, and I seriously considered opening the door and meeting her. But at the end, I got scared. In my mind, it doesn't make sense that such a strange person is calling me in the middle of the night. And she was ugly as duck. I called my mom. She went to my bed and slept with me. She didn't even ask why I was calling her. The next day, I told her, and I remember that I even told my friends and my grandmother. She was the only one who believed me or tried to believe me. I couldn't forget that, ever. What did she want from me? A few days ago, I was spending the night at the motel with my boyfriend. And it was weird because that night I felt a strange vibe in that place. Suddenly, I was talking to him in front of one giant mirror, and when he walked to the other side of the place, I saw my reflection on the mirror, and for God's sake, I saw myself, and I didn't recognize me for a moment because I saw that woman, that dwarf. I didn't really see her, but my posture, my hair all over my face, and something in the reflection made me remember her. It was pretty scary, I swear. I never thought of that woman again until that night. The Dark Watchers of Big Sur. I have recently discovered the phenomenon of the Dark Watchers, black motionless figures that stand on the lonely peaks and ridges of the coastal Santa Lucia Mountains in the Big Sur region. It's a fascinating thing that's gripped my interest, especially considering how old the accounts of these beings are. The first Spanish settlers until now have recorded seeing them, and there's been no slowdown in sightings. The Nereids, together with Vrykolaikes, Greek vampires, and Kalikansauroi, a type of goblin, are the big three of modern Greek folklore. By this, I mean that they have the most accounts and tales being told about them. The English translation for the Nereids is fairies, but I will refrain from using it because, as you will see, they're very different from how commonly fairies are described in foreign folklore. Ancient origins of the Nereids. You may have already been able to discern that the word Nereids derives from the ancient Greek Nereids. If you know ancient Greek mythology, then you will have heard of the Nereids, no doubt. They were minor sea divinities, the 50 daughters of the so-called Old Man of the Sea, Nereus, who is their namesake, and an Oceanid nymph, Doris. The Nereids were benevolent and friendly toward sailors. Some famous ones among them were Amphitrite, the wife of Poseidon, and Thetis, the mother of Achilles. However, unlike the Nereids were neither tied to the sea nor were they so benevolent. The Nereids instead seem to have drawn from the myths of the nymphs in general. They have been described by folklorists from time to time as degenerate minor ancient goddesses, as in What Happened to the Nymphs After Greeks Converted to Christianity. What do nymphs look like? The Nereids are always described as otherworldly beautiful women. In those few accounts that go into detail about their looks, they describe them as having flowing golden blonde hair, fair skin, slender shapes, long legs, and wearing intricately woven white clothes. Special attention is given to the Nereida's mantili, a piece of thin cloth that women use like a headscarf. This is important to Nereids because many accounts say that if she loses it, she loses her powers and becomes mortal. They do not have wings, and they are not tiny, but your average human size. That's why I don't like calling them fairies in English, and I insist on calling them Nereids. The powers of the Nereids. Nereids are essentially spirit beings. Most tales have them invisible to the naked eye, except at high noon and midnight, when they are at their peak of strength and thus made visible to all. Many accounts are about hearing them but not seeing them. Besides their on and off invisibility, a wide array of supernatural powers have been reported in the many accounts and tales about them. Most often reported is their ability to afflict people with inexplicable diseases of the mind and body. They seem to be able to steal a person's health and sanity at will. Victims kidnapped by Nereids are often found days later gravely ill, dying, or having lost all reason. Another widely reported phenomenon is that they are capable of stealing people's voices, sometimes permanently. It is said that you will lose your voice if a Nereida calls you by your name and you respond to her call. Nereids also seem to have power over the elements. When there are a lot of Nereids gathered together, they are able to create whirlwinds. They do so by dancing, as few accounts have reported Nereids dancing around inside a whirlwind. Their whirlwinds are strong enough to blow people off their feet, uproot trees, or even destroy entire houses. Besides air, they also have some mystical power over water. It is said they can make water still, and by that, I mean still running water. They can stop the flow of rivers and streams when they spring. But it's also been reported that such water holds amazing healing properties, and Nereids may let humans have some if they make them an offering. Besides their supernatural strengths, the Nereids are told to be very skilled in many arts and crafts, such as singing, dancing, playing musical instruments, weaving, cooking, and washing clothes, but not just that. It is said that if one can capture a Nereida and put her to work, his business will flourish, and he will become rich. Any job you make her do, Nereida will excel at it. I have several stories about Mexico. It is a place of many myths and legends. This one is one a friend of mine recounted to me about his uncle and his friend stuck in a horrifying circumstance. So my buddy's uncle and his friend were headed home on a highway one night ago in the state of Oaxaca. You see, they rode in one of those old flatbed trucks that are used to put whatever vegetables or fruits might have been picked that day. They were farmers, most were, as Oaxaca was very rural at the time and had only just had a highway installed with actual concrete. And as they were returning home, the uncle noticed something in the rearview mirror and made out what seemed to be a horse about, I'll say, maybe 150 feet away. He couldn't really make out its features and didn't think anything of it till he drifted off to sleep in the passenger seat. As he slept, the uncle had a small nightmare of a horse with large black eyes running up to his passenger side that startled him awake. He gathered his bearings when he looked over to his buddy, who was driving with a terrified look on his face and going about 50 miles an hour, which at the time was pretty fast for a truck that size. He asked, "Why are you driving so fast?" And the friend responded by saying they were being followed. He said that for the past couple miles, that horse in the rear view was slowly inching its way closer and closer to the vehicle. That was when the panic began to settle in, and they both felt immense fear wash over them. They sped up to about 65 to try and get away, but the clanking of the hooves of this horse slowly kept getting louder and louder behind them. The one driving said not to turn around and look anymore but to just look ahead and not look at the horse because it seemed to gain on them whenever they glanced back at it. The uncle closed his eyes in fear, only listening, and when the hooves inched closer and closer, he glanced to the side of the window and saw the large black eyes of the horse looking directly at his friend from the passenger side, as it had caught up now. The uncle screamed for his friend not to look and to just look straight because the horse had a fixated gaze on him. They sped up all they could, and still the horse kept a swift pace, still staring at the driver. When he finally glanced, he began to cry, overwhelmed with emotion and panic, when the horse suddenly began to slow down. And as it did, the uncle saw it in the rear view once more, except this time it had no legs. It was just standing on the road, floating, staring at them with its huge black eyes. They told the grandfather of the man driving when they arrived home what they had witnessed. And he told them that the road that was built there had gone straight through sacred Nahuatl territory, and they had been lucky to drive past the area at this time of night because everyone had felt that the ground there was salado, or salted, meaning washed with bad energy. The Green Children of Woolpit. There was this one interesting story I came across more than 800 years ago about two green children who emerged from the earth that I would like to share. The legends take place back in the 12th century within the Suffolk village of Woolpit, England, near Bury St Edmunds. During harvest time, local villagers were working in the fields when two young children emerged from dug ditches to trap wolves. A boy and a girl, with green-tinged skin, wore strange clothing made from unfamiliar material and spoke an unknown language. They were found wandering around bewildered by the villagers, who brought the two back to town. The children were taken to the house of local landowner Sir Richard de Conn, where, for several days, they refused to eat anything that was brought. Eventually, the villagers discovered the two would eat the locally harvested beans and would survive on this food for a few months before later acquiring a taste for bread. The legend goes on to say that as time passed, the boy became greatly ill and died, while the girl continued to grow into a young woman. She adjusted to life within the village, became baptized, learned the language, and gradually her skin lost its green color. Some accounts of the myth say that the woman took the name Agnes Barr and married a royal official. What made this legend extraordinary was the account the girl gave of her origins once she could understand them after learning the language. She told me that she and the boy were brothers and sisters and came from the land of St. Martin. In her homeland, there was no sun, but it was perpetual twilight. The people were also green, as were she and her brother. She recounts that one day they were looking after their father's livestock in the fields and stumbled across a cavern. There was a loud sound of bells, which they decided to check out, and they entered the cave, where they wandered through the darkness for some time. Eventually they exited the cavern but were immediately blinded by the glaring sunlight. After some time, they recovered and attempted to locate the mouth of the cave they exited, but instead were found by the villagers. The story was recorded by two 12th century chroniclers, Ralph of Coggeshall, an abbot of a Cistercian monastery at Coggeshall, and William of Newburgh, an English historian and canon at the Augustinian Newburgh Priory. This legend continues to be told and referenced over the centuries, even to this day. There have been many explanations given for the origins of the Green Children of Woolpit. One thought that has been around since the legend was first told is that the siblings were actually from an underground world. An alternative theory suggests the children were aliens from another planet or dimension. A more practical idea is that the two were orphans suffering from a disease causing a strange pigmentation in the skin. A simpler explanation could be that the legend is nothing more than another fabricated fairy tale, as other similar stories of green children later followed. I live in the foothills of Appalachia, in the middle of nowhere, in front of a wildlife preserve. Every other weekend I have off, I go back there to fish, hunt, or just camp out. I've been here for over 7 years, and during these 7 years, I've become somewhat acquainted with a small white creature that lives at the edge of my property and the preserve. I don't think he's hostile, but he enjoys spooking me and a couple friends I brought camping. He's about 1.5 feet tall and moves by hopping and crawling, and if you look directly at him, he seems blurry, not as if he has hair but as if it's a photo of something white moving around. I tried to find a story about a similar creature but came up empty. I was wondering if anyone has any old folklore or anything about him. We Mexicans have what we call La Llorona, the weeping woman. Legends say that she is the spirit of a woman dressed in white robes, crying for her children, as she drowned her children in her previous life and continues to search for them in the afterlife. She's rumored to be seen at night around bodies of water. If she sees a child, she will snatch them away, mistaking them for her own. It's kind of an old folk tale warning children not to go out at night. Another popular crypto of ours is La Chupacabra, or the goat sucker. Their claim to fame is that the creature attacks livestock at the dead of night and drains the blood from their bodies, not unlike a vampire. No one can really agree on what they look like, save that the creature is a large, heavy creature with spines running from its head to its long tail. Otherwise, people can't figure out if it's reptilian, mammalian, fur, scales, or whatever. Here in Arizona, we have a surprising amount of forested wilderness, mountains, and scrublands between all of the dusty, dry desert. Of course, that means that a few tales and ancient legends have been passed around here and there. One that comes to mind is the Mogollon monster, which is kind of like our version of Bigfoot. I remember hearing about him through a friend who was in the Boy Scouts. Seen around the pine forests of Mogollon Rim, Arizona, he's described as having reddish-brownish hair and smells not unlike rotting peat moss or spoiled fish. Oh, and he sometimes screams like a mother ducking banshee at night. There are all sorts of tall tales about him, including that he likes investigating campsites in the wild, throwing rocks at humans, and even decapitating deer before eating them. A few towns up north of Phoenix that are closer to the wilderness actually have annual races and festivals in his honor, if you can believe it. A more legendary creature is the Thunderbird. It is a Native American legend from around the northwest area of what's now the United States, but has found its way down south too. The Thunderbird is a massive bird-like creature and is the overseer of the overworld, as opposed to the great horned snake of the underworld. It creates lightning with the flap of its wings and hurls bolts of lightning at creatures of the underworld. However, in relation to cryptozoology, the Thunderbird has been described as a massive bird that's been spotted on occasion. It has a giant wingspan, much like ancient birds that lived alongside early humans. Unfortunately, no Thunderbirds have ever been photographed. I personally think that this is more of an urban legend than a cryptid. In the Dominican Republic, we have a lot. One of them is the cow demon, a monster creature that guards a land. Usually, the owner has a pact with the devil. Then the devil gives the owner an egg that he or she has to incubate for several days. When the days were needed, the owner of the land buried the egg in the land. But, as with the pacts with the devil, When the time comes, the baka will ask for the most treasured thing, person, or animal that the owner has, and he'll need to deliver. While the baka is on the land, all business and crops will prosper. But if the owner does not pay, he will have diseases and disasters. Another thing that is much more known is La Ciguapa, a water spirit that lives near rivers. A naked woman with long and silky hair and feet backwards. Is always imagined with the features of a Taino woman. She runs and hides in the forest and is known for making the travelers lose their way. As an African, Hispanic, or Taino heritage country, we have Santeria, a religious mix of African voodoo and Christian folklore. The gallipote is a wizard-like creature. A man or woman who practices Dominican voodoo can transform into any animal at will, a lot like the Native Americans as skin changers. It is usually mentioned when you pass by an old man or woman in the path and then find out she or he arrived earlier than you. That old man is a gallipote, meaning that old man is a gallipote. I believe that this man transformed into a dog, ass, mule, etc. and then passed by you without notice. The headless lady is a local myth many of us have encountered. In the Middle Ages, we had this myth that during a war, the fort of the local ruler had been taken and his bride or fiancé was imprisoned. As the war went in favor of the side the local lord was on, the bride or fiancé was executed. Her body was bound to a boulder with chains as revenge. Her body would go missing during a hot summer afternoon while being guarded. The chains were broken, but there was never a sound. Ever since then, during the summer, she haunts the forest where the fort was. She's been haunting the village for over 1,000 years now. She appears a bit before sunset. The sound of rattling chains is the first sign of her presence. Birds and animals are fleeing the second. The third is seeing her. Although we scare tourists by saying you won't survive seeing her, it's only partially true. Locals who've seen her usually survive, but if the farmers near the edge of the forest hear the rattling of chains, someone has gone missing. We often find them back in the forest, often a while away from the paths, and it's always medically explained as a bad fall. I've encountered her twice, the first time alone. I was 13 and jogging to forget a bad day I had. I was about a quarter through the forest, and there was a small town a while beyond the other side that I was hoping to visit. I heard chains and thought it was just some kid trying to scare tourists. Then I almost got run over by a deer, which was starting to make me worry. The third thing I saw were chains coming off the ground. They were rusted and brittle. They started to wind around a tree and then started going to another, then another, and by the third, I realized it was trying to close me in. I ran as fast as I could, and I managed to get out before it got back to the first tree. I got back home and tried not to think about it again. The other encounter was when I was 16 with a girl I was with. We decided to go find a quiet place in the forest to do our things. As we're kissing, I hear the chains. I immediately got up and focused, then I saw 4 birds flying directly at us. At which point I just simply told her, we should go. Local kids like to pretend to be ghosts and beat up people with chains. I thought it would work better than explaining a ghost story. We just walked away, and since then I have gone around the forest, just to avoid any chance encounters. In Utah, there's a story of the Purple Lady, who haunts the Rio Grande Depot in Salt Lake City. It used to be a train station. The story goes that she was waiting at the train station for her fiancé to return home. When he stepped from his train, she confronted him and asked why he hadn't written her in the many months he'd been gone. It turned into an ugly argument. The fiancé claimed that she'd ripped her engagement ring from her finger and gave it back to him, and in a fit of rage, he flung it onto the tracks. He said she ran after it and jumped onto the tracks to get it, not seeing the oncoming train. She was hit, and she died. The train station is now a cafe, gallery, and history center. People regularly claim to see her there, dressed in purple. Ladies will see her staring at them through the mirror as they wash their hands in the women's restroom. She'll turn on faucets and cause the lights to flicker. People have claimed to hear singing from the bathroom when no one is in there. She'll mess with paintings in the gallery, move things, and allegedly lock workers out of the building. What really changes the story, though, according to a book I read on the haunting, a group of ghost investigators came to the depot and were trying to interview the Purple Lady. They caught an EVP, and the woman's voice stated clearly, "He pushed me." The Devil's Tramping Ground. I have a friend who is really into the paranormal, like myself. Let's call him Jake. It was October 2018, and we just wanted to go ghost hunting or explore supposedly haunted buildings or areas. We have been researching and have decided our drive limit is 4 hours. I came across a place called the Devil's Tramping Ground. At the place, there is a circle in the woods that can't grow grass, and the trees make a circle around it. As legend has it, the devil himself uses that circle of sand and dirt as a portal. He comes to earth at night and stomps on the ground, pacing back and forth. We read that if you try to sleep there, on the circle, you will hear a soothing female singing, which will put you to sleep, and then you will wake up in a different location. So what did we do? I brought tents, sleeping bags, chairs, and beer, of course. Okay, back to the story. Me and Jake were planning our trip, and another one of my buddies caught wind of it. Let's call him Nick. We were all set to go on Friday when we got out of work. We left base at around 4 p.m. but didn't actually hit the road until roughly 8 p.m. because we kept getting sidetracked at different stores. We get off the highway, it's close to midnight. We have our GPS on, and it was time for us to go down the only damn road with no street lights. Of course. We start driving down that narrow, dark road slowly so we can find the clearing for the devil's tramping ground. We read that there would be satanic symbols in front of the clearing, written on the road. We had our eyes peeled. There was something odd about this road. ISHTU, we were being chased the entire way by about 10 dogs and one black dog. Every dog was barking except for that black dog. And he kept appearing in the woods to the left of us and in front of us as we were driving, as if he were trying to turn us around. We found the symbols and knew it was it, the dogs hadn't followed us that far. We parked and got out with flashlights first to scope out the area. I'm not going to lie, it was extremely unsettling. We made our way up to the circle and thought, perfect. Let's go get our shit. Fast forward about an hour, it's quiet. We have our tent set up on the circle, with our chairs set up surrounding our cooler. We were just telling ghost stories and drinking. Nothing really seemed to bother us other than the occasional twig snapping that sounded like footsteps and the feeling of being watched. We just chalked it up to animals. It's 2 a.m. now. I start to hear voices all around me, and I'm not the only one. Nick and Jake heard it too. It felt like we were about to be jumped by a group of men surrounding us. But we knew whatever it was wasn't human. The voices stopped, and ISHTU not, but at the same time, the car light turned on. We went to the car to find all of the doors open. Unnerved, we slowly closed all the doors and went back to drinking. 2:30 a.m., we are all on edge. I was not even drunk at this point because of the events that just took place. Everyone was silent. I could hear and feel my heart beating out of my chest. You'll never believe it. We all heard beautiful humming coming from every direction. I wish I could describe how it sounded. But we knew that was not good. We all learned it as the singing was going on. Without saying a word, we all got up, went to the car, and got out of there. We then visited Lydia's bridge because it was nearby, and it is said that Lydia walks the road on the bridge at night. We didn't see anything, so we slept in a nearby Walmart parking lot in the car. And we went back the next morning for our things. In the late 90s, in one of the districts in my city, a young woman died after she gave birth to her daughter. According to what my people believe, after their deaths, women who died in labor tend to come back as vengeful spirits known as Knilanak. These women usually suffer violent deaths at the hands of men, which makes them unable to rest in peace. And after they were reincarnated as Knilanak, they'd roam the night searching for their child and preying upon lonely men, sometimes women, in the streets. Back to the main story, a few years after her death, people in that district claimed that they could hear the high-pitched laughter and crying of a woman on one of the streets in that district, and sometimes the Knilanak would stalk and attack men and women who were walking alone in that district. And over the years, the number of people claiming to have heard the same thing increased. It was so popular, so much so, that even psychics were brought in to investigate those claims. According to one of the psychics, the woman who died in labor in the late 1990s has come back as Knilanak in search of her child. The Knilanak is often heard calling her daughter's name while crying in the night while searching for her. Even after 20 years, there are still claims of people hearing and even encountering the Knilanak in that district. Her child has grown into a woman now, and according to stories in my city, the child would sometimes encounter and even visit her mother. This story is kind of unsettling, creepy, and sad at the same time. Spooklight. Around the Joplin, Missouri, area, there is a phenomenon that is commonly referred to as the spooklight. There are a range of different legends that attempt to explain this occurrence. Many scientific explanations have been put forward, and they usually entail something from swapping gas to road lights. What I encountered on this night was not this. Upon arriving at the site, I was instructed to shut off all electronics and walk to the area. After a couple-minute walk, I saw something I have yet to rationalize. A glowing ball of white light around 2 feet in diameter floated about 10 to 15 feet above the ground. It moved in a figure-8 pattern that went laterally about 20 feet. The whole time, it illuminated the gravel road below. I am more than willing to accept any explanations for this phenomenon. There was an old legend about a lost town in the forest near where I lived, and for the most part, All it was a legend. However, it was noted as being true, and a ghost town is near my town. The story that I'm about to tell happened when I was 11 and still irks me to this day. My dad used to take me on little off-road rides in his Jeep. It wasn't necessarily an off-road one either. It was a Cherokee, so it wasn't really built for backwoods dirt trails. He decided to do this one that was out in the park with me and told me you'd be fun and we would go check out the ruins of an old building, and then we decided to go. We were about an hour into the park. There was one of those official vehicle-only gates on this dirt road, and usually that would stop people, but my dad just decided to break the lock and push it open anyway. My father was always the best at listening to rules. About 30 minutes into our drive on this road, he's shining a flashlight out the windows trying to find this building and has his headlights on full, and we're just both looking for any signs of anything. Eventually, we come upon this really steep hill. He says, "Oh, I think I remember this," and just guns it up the hill. Naturally, we get stuck at a certain angle where we can't reverse or accelerate. My dad never likes to admit he's wrong. He said he could fix it and started tinkering with it. I was very curious and still am, so I got the flashlight and started looking in the woods around us, really just worried for bears or wolves. I noticed a little light in the valley below us and turned off the flashlight to see it. While my dad was cursing at our car, I decided to get a little closer to the light and see if I could figure out what it was, mainly to see if it was somebody who could help us. As I got closer to it, the trees took it apart a little, and it was a very small town. The best way I can describe it is like that town from the movie Big Fish. Just a very numbered set of small buildings. As I got closer, I heard voices and saw people. But something just seemed weird about it, like they weren't really there. I decided to try to get closer to the town, but the closer I got, the more weirded out I got. I eventually felt like if I didn't turn around, I would never come back, which is a very odd feeling to have, and decided to just go back up to my dad. He didn't get the car unstuck, at least by himself, and we just slept in the car. The next morning, a park ranger showed up, and after a very lengthy talk with my dad and a very hefty ticket, he helped us get the car unstuck, and we were on our way. Before we left, I tried to catch another glimpse at the village, and it was the ruins my dad was talking about. I talked to the park ranger about it, and all he said was that it was once a thriving village that was just lost in time. I decided not to say anything about what I saw to the ranger and did tell my dad, but his usual skepticism turned me away from bringing it up anymore. I have since visited that same village, and it's a really pretty place. I told my friend about what I saw, and I believed me for the most part. We decided to stay one night around the woods and try to see if anything happened, and of course nothing did. But I still remember that night as if it were yesterday, and I still get goosebumps from the feeling of visiting it. A little backstory: I am a mentally well, moderately successful, young wife and mother in the deep south, on the edge of the coast, and have been in this beach town my whole life. You get a few miles west from the beach, and you're immediately in the country. My mother's side has lived here as far back as memory serves, and my father is a Sioux whose mother moved him here as a child away from the res. Since I can remember, my mother's side of the family has had run-ins with the Wampus cat. Legends vary depending on where you are, but commonly around here, it's said she was a Cherokee woman who snuck into the woods to listen in on a male-only meeting that included the chief and their medicine man, not sure if it's the correct term for this tribe. She wore the skin of a cougar as a disguise, but she was found out, and the medicine man cursed her to forever wear the cougar skin. She now stalks people, for what reason, I don't know. But it follows me. And my family. Always has. We've gotten so used to the Wampus cat that we just expect her when we move to a new house, the seasons change, or we find ourselves in a moment of emotional weakness. When my mother had a rough day being bullied in middle school, back in the 80s, she was crying and riding her bike home down a country dirt road. The sun is setting, but it's not dark out yet. Behind her, she hears this shriek. I've heard it before, and it sounds like when an eagle screams, but with that gurgling gutturalness of a cougar's roar. So she turns around, and she sees a huge creature, dark matted fur, in a stance like a gorilla stands in when it walks on its knuckles, back legs crouched a bit, chest and head up, and supported by the arms on the knuckles. She turns around and races on her bike all the way home. She told her mom what she saw, and she calmly said, "That's a Wampus cat. They've never hurt us, they just like to spook you." And that was that. So I grew up with a Native American father who was superstitious as all hell and practically jumped under the bed to hide when we heard the Wampus cat scream in the backyard some nights, while my mom and grandmother just kind of acknowledged, "Oh, it's the cat again." And I have gone my whole life with this as completely normal. Even when I got married and my husband was out by the woods with me, we'd hear that scream, see the leaves on the forest floor kick up as they stalked us, never coming to close, and have to realize that to people who didn't grow up in my town, this was a terrifying experience. To me, it's like when you occasionally see a cardinal in the trees. A bit different than the day-to-day, but nothing life-changing. My closest encounter was one night in high school, when my friend and I and her boyfriend were sitting on the front porch, enjoying the nighttime salt air and the lightning bugs. A huge, gorilla-sized, extremely hairy animal runs up to the front of the porch and screams like hell. Now I'm semi-used to the creature, but I don't want it 5 feet from me. We go to her bedroom, and for about an hour, we hear it stalking back and forth under her window, about 10 feet down. Coastal towns have raised houses on stilts in case of hurricanes. Growling, spitting, screaming, and rolling around in the foliage. Just being pesky and grumpy. Finally, it wanders off, all is quiet, and we fall asleep. Every once in a while, I'll still hear it. It's just life here. This town is extremely haunted. I've grown up a few miles from the Fort Fisher battleground and many other historic and tragic places. My experience with a lechuza. A lechuza is a woman who sheds her human skin at night to reveal that she's actually a wrinkly monster with hot coals for eyes. It commonly takes the form of an owl. Lechuza means owl, or a fireball, and eats people. Mostly drunk men. I was a Girl Scout. We went camping in the mountains. That night, all of us 20-plus girls were cramped into a tent for 10 people. It was really hot, so I left the tent to look for the cabin where my parents were sleeping. That was a bad idea. I got lost. After a while, something started chasing me. It cornered me. It glared at me. Its eyes were dimly lit. And then it left. It left a trail of feathers. Thoughts on this? Most people remember the stories about the Turner beast when that dog was found hit by a car. Someone claimed it was their lost dog. Even before that, I never believed what they found was the same creature with the legends and stories attached to it. I think there is something bigger out there that is still there. The second-hand account I heard that freaked me out the most was something that happened before I was born. My mom's friend was walking home in the dark on Lower Street in Turner. No street lights and only the moonlight to see. This guy was almost home when he saw a figure the same size as him on all fours crawling up the road towards him. He immediately starts booking it and looks behind to see the thing get on 2 legs to give chase. It chased him to his front door and left scratch marks on his door, which he found the next day. La Diablesse, or La Diablesse, is a character in Caribbean folklore. A human woman usually has an attractive body and clothing but a hideous face that she keeps hidden. She has 1 human foot and 1 cow hoof. She lures males into the forest so that they get lost and can never find their way back, so they end up dying either by getting eaten by a wild animal or by some other gruesome means. This happened in Trinidad in the 1980s. My uncle was living in the house I live in currently, my grandfather's house that my mother inherited. In those days, it was my grandparents and their 8 children. My uncle was one of the older siblings and would work late night shifts, so he would return home between the hours of 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. My street then wasn't as developed as it is now. There was a lot of bush and forested area, with a few houses scattered in between. My house is about a quarter mile away, and the road wasn't paved at that time. It was more of a track than a road. So one night, when my uncle returned home from one of his night shifts, he saw, from a distance, a woman walking down the street. From the look of her clothing, he assumed it was my senile great-grandmother. She had a few instances where she would wander off and reach faraway places, so initially my uncle thought it was her. He saw her familiar dress and the white shawl she always had draped over her head, and he could make out pieces of the tattoos she had on her arms. Now he thought it was strange. It was the latest he had ever seen her outside, and her house was at least 10 minutes away from ours. He called out to her a couple times, but she didn't turn around. She kept walking. At this time, my uncle decided to follow her and get her back to her home. As he neared her, he realized something really weird. He kept calling out to her, and yet she didn't turn around. When he looked down, he saw that my great-grandmother had a cow hoof where her left foot should have been. He was really close to her now, and when he noticed it, the woman stopped dead in her tracks. My uncle, in sheer terror, turned around and said he had never run so fast in his entire life. He raced home, and since that incident, he has always had my grandfather wait up for him until he eventually leaves that job. I live in eastern Finland, in a small city. Most of the cities here are like openings or holes in a forest, if you look at them from the sky. In Finnish folklore, there are many stories of forest creatures and spirits that guard the forests and lead people astray. There are even stories of forests shrouding a person so that he or she gets lost in it for years, that there is an upside world where all kinds of wondrous and scary ancient things live. There are stories of people going into the forest shroud and making it out years later with odd stories to tell. There's this birch forest near my home. A black river streams through it and floods it in the spring. I usually walk the dog in there because I think it's beautiful. Pure birch tree forests aren't that common, even here. And the trees are old. Some of them are huge. Old, full of fungi, and twisted. Sometimes I take the kids there too. My daughter is very sensitive in a way. From an early age, she's been seeing and talking to imaginary things, some of them odd. For example, my now dead grandmother. My daughter, who never met her, often talked about her. One day, when we were eating at our dinner table, she just stood up, looked out the window, burst into tears, and cried, "Goodbye, Mama." That was the end of the imaginary friend that we thought was my grandmother. It's curious, because I think my daughter kind of reminds me of her too. One time, during the day, when we were walking among the birch woods, my daughter said there was somebody there. A dead horse named Loda. She told me it was very old, and she lived there. I laughed at her. I'm just used to these kinds of stories from her. I smile, shrug, or laugh at them, but there's always this weird undertone to them. The stories are fantastic and imaginative, but eerily consistent, like an unconscious hint of a memory. I think she's just a smart child with a good imagination, but when she cries at night and I walk into the room to find her sleepwalking and pointing to an empty chair in the middle of the room with her tiny index finger, it feels uncanny. There's something between the lines. A couple of months ago, it was a full moon, and I was walking my dog at night. I was going for a walk in the birch forest. The moon painted the frost bluish. As I approached the forest, the birch trees rose from the frozen ground like these white upside-down runs, and behind them was just black, with hints of more white sides of the trees. It must have been like 100 meters away when I heard something from the dark forest. Something heavy was moving around there. Crashing away in the forest. Sometimes I've heard the rabbits scream in there when a lynx or a fox gets to them. The rabbits scream like a small child when they are dying. But this was something different. A wild boar? Maybe a moose? The dog was also interested in the sounds. Its ears point upwards. We walked closer to the white trees, and the noises got louder. We both stopped to look. The dog didn't bark. It just pointed its nose towards the sound. We were like 20 meters away from the tree line when the sound stopped. For a while, it was just quiet. Then it started again. Something started running in the forest, near the tree line. Not from us, but towards us. It gives me chills just to remember this. Heavy, amazingly fast steps. I started to think it was bipedal, according to the sounds it made. 20 to 30 meters it made in what seemed like only a couple of seconds. In the pitch black, there is an uneven forest ground between the trunks, over fallen trees and bushes. It's not a human being. It's not a moose, I remember thinking. My dog's head turned according to the movement. And then it stopped. Right before us. I felt the darkness staring at me, and I stared back. For sure, I wasn't going into the forest with something in the dark facing us, just to the left of the path. I was going to walk to enter the forest. Making sounds in front of us. I started to back away from the tree line, still facing the sounds. Whatever was in there was interested in us but didn't seem to want to come out of the forest. I wasn't going to turn my back on it, that's for sure. My hands curled into fists. The dog had its tail between its legs as we backed away. The sounds continued. I could hear them even from over 100 meters away. It was then that I turned my back on it and started walking away. I walked fast, thinking of all the possible forms the darkness could have taken if I'd gone in or had a flashlight with me. The terror I felt was real. I rushed to my home and locked the door. Even my wife got nervous seeing me spooked like that. I've been in the forest almost every night since then. Walking the dog. I have never heard anything since. But I've always been on alert since that night. Wondering if not knowing what was in there that night might be better than knowing. I've never seen or heard anything move so fast through the woods. But then I think of the dead horse my daughter said she saw. I know little children see things, but I also know their interpretations of them might be off. They see more than us adults, who have learned to see the world around us in a certain way but therefore lack the ability to describe it. Maybe she didn't see a dead horse at all, but something that she couldn't describe in any other way. It could have been a forest spirit from ancient times. Maybe a keeper that sometimes plays games and tricks on those who come to its domain? Or a keeper that shrouds the forest walker, dragging him to the underworld, never to return? My great-grandmother always used to tell a story about a werewolf-like creature called the Loup Garou. At some point in her life, according to the version my grandpa used to tell me, his mom lived along the Sabine River and had some friends over one night for supper. My great-grandmother lived in a house out in the woods, a short distance from town, and everyone was about ready to start heading back. It was past dusk, but not too late, and the guests were just starting to say their goodbyes when a wailing howl shattered through the stillness of the woods. Everyone inside the house just froze, and one of the women uttered that it was the Loup Garou. They started shutting the windows and locking the doors because it was believed that the creature couldn't get inside a locked house. After a short time, when all the house was locked down, my great-grandmother and her guests gathered in the front parlor and hid in the shadows. From the woods again rose a piercing howl, and the sounds were much closer now. As they all huddled in silence in the parlor, a heavy form stepped up onto the porch, the weight of its massive body straining the wooden planks. It walked past the door, jiggling its locked knob, and its heavy breath fogged up the window panes as the beast stepped into the bright beams of the moonlight. It looked inside, but all the people just remained entirely motionless, their breaths held tightly in their lungs. The creature let out a mighty howl, one that my grandpa said still made my great-grandmother tremble years later, and the beast left and vanished back into the woods. The dinner party had been so frightened that they all just ended up staying the night. In the morning, there were giant footprints in the mud around my great-grandmother's house, with long claws sticking out from each of the toes. Being single at the time, my great-grandmother didn't stay in that house much longer. She moved into town and, from there, into the Houston area. That's the story I used to hear from my grandpa. I have no idea if it's true or not, but that's the luster of folklore. It was last Sunday night during the blood moon/lunar eclipse, and my friend and I decided to drive up this mountain that's a little about 40 minutes outside of town. We live in northwest Washington right by the border, in some rural communities. This mountain borders a Native American reservation as well, which I'll get into later, and is now used for logging and has public access to trails and all that. So my friend had been to this mountain about a year before, and he swears he saw something in the trees that looked sort of like a man but was way off, and it disappeared before he could have another look. So going to this mountain, I was already thinking to myself, oh great, I bet we're going to come across some Bigfoot shit or whatever, but I'm stoked for the pretty view, so it wasn't a big deal. We reached this mountain and began making our way up, and I immediately felt very uneasy but couldn't really put my finger on it. We probably spent a good hour driving to the top because we kept getting lost on side roads for small amounts of time, and I'm just not getting good vibes at all. There was one spot, in particular, that just made my skin crawl. Normally, when I get a bad vibe, I can feel around, I don't know if that makes sense, and kind of get a sense of where it's coming from, but this time I couldn't pinpoint it, everything around me was giving me this feeling. So we reach the top and have to turn around because our dumb asses didn't realize they closed the top viewpoint for the night and blocked the road with a gate, which, in hindsight, we are both very grateful for now. On the way down, I noticed that my friend is visibly on edge too, and he does not believe in the paranormal at all and thought I was full of shit when I told him all my experiences. We both just wanted to get the duck off that mountain, and we keep seeing stuff moving in the trees but can't determine if it was just shadows playing tricks or not. It very well could have been. When we're a good portion of the way down, we stopped the car for a split second because there was a pretty view just from the road, and we at least wanted to see some sort of view since the top was closed. So we stop, and we both hear this noise that is unlike anything I have ever heard. It did not sound like an animal, and I spent the whole next day listening to various animal noises to try and compare, but nothing came close. It sounded so aggressive, almost metallic, and it came from directly behind the car. Side note, whenever I have an experience where I'm positive I encountered an entity, my eyes start to water and I sort of cry. The instant I heard this sound, my eyes started filling with tears, so I already knew something sketchy was up. We both just look at each other, and we just feel this presence. I have never felt so much evil and hate in my life. It felt like it was directly behind us. It just felt really big and really ducking pissed at us. I have never been so full of absolute terror. So my friend screams, and he ducking floors it, and I instantly shine my phone light into the back seat because it felt like whatever was there was right in the car with us. I remember saying, "What the duck was that?" as he's flooring it, and he said, "I don't know, but I don't want to hear that ever again." So I'm basically sobbing as we are hauling asses down that mountain, and I'm trying to calm us down by talking about my history class. We finally reach the road and get our asses home. I remember him turning to me and saying, "I know exactly what you've been talking about now." My friend is the biggest skeptic, and even he absolutely could not explain what we heard and felt. So we get back to his place and are flipping out SHT, and he starts to look into that mountain and the tribe that lives next to it. I begin to wonder if his experience the year before had anything to do with it, and he immediately finds native folklore from the local tribes that has to do with these creatures called stick Indians, which are malevolent forest or mountain spirits that sort of resemble what we think of as Bigfoot. They lead lost travelers astray with eerie noises, clicks, and whistles. I'm not extremely educated on this topic, though, so any further information or ideas would be appreciated. So he's convinced that's what we encountered, which definitely fits everything we experienced on that mountain. I have no ducking clue what we encountered, I just know how scared I was. Normally, when I have an experience, I freak out for a hot minute, and then I'm fine and think of it as actually kind of cool, but this time around, I want absolutely nothing to do with it. I'm still terrified and have trouble falling asleep because all I can do is think about what happened. Whatever we both felt was extremely negative and aggressive. 4 years ago, my cousin had her first baby, and when her baby was less than a month old, she decided to take him to my aunt's house, who lives 2 hours away from my house. My cousin lives an hour away. While on her way there, she got a little tired, so she decided to stop by our place and tell my aunt that she was in our house. My aunt then insisted on coming over and taking her there instead of her driving all the way there by herself. My aunt came over and stayed a while, and she mentioned something strange that had happened earlier. The live-in maid came in from the backyard, panicking. Once she got her to calm down, she told her that when she was outside, she saw a demon on the neighbor's roof and that it looked like a ghostly pale woman with long black hair and a long black dress, and she moved in an unnatural way, I can't remember how she described it, and that it smiled at her, which freaked her out. So my aunt went outside to see the thing, and she didn't see anything on the roof, so she told the maid she was probably imagining it, but she was insisting that it was a demon. The two of them went to my aunt's house, and upon entering, the maid got nervous, took my aunt to the side, and told her that she had neglected to mention that the demon was known in her culture, Indonesia, to eat newborn babies. She did not mention this, as there weren't any babies in the house. My aunt, being the skeptic that she is, didn't want to scare my cousin without being sure, so she asked her not to tell her and went to the backyard to try and see the creature first. Meanwhile, my aunt's sons came home, and they got to talking with my cousin and mentioned something odd they saw when leaving the house earlier that evening. They described a dark figure on the roof of a different house that turned around and had a white face. They didn't seem too concerned, and they laughed it off. My cousin recalled what my aunt said earlier, so they went to ask the maid about it, and she told them it was the same thing she saw and that it was a demon that eats newborn babies. This freaked out my cousin, who grabbed her son and went to find my aunt, who had been waiting outside for 40 minutes, demanding to go back to my house. Is anyone familiar with this folklore creature? Any idea what the creature is called? Dyer Lane, California. Dyer Lane is a stretch of road located in Roseville, California, in a small patch of rural land that sits just after the urban town. I live about 20 minutes from said lane and all of its history. Dyer Lane is claimed to be one of the most haunted locations in California, claiming to be the resting ground for multiple KKK hanging and burning victims, murder victims, and other general paranormal happenings. The most recent murder I can account for at the moment was the body dumping of a woman in her 20s. If you visit the road, you'll find a small shrine of candles and a cross near where she was found, as well as multiple others along the lane for other victims of different happenings. To expand on the paranormal aspect of this, I was told by a close friend of mine, we'll call him Blake, on my first visit to the lane about its many folk tales. One of which is a small staircase that leads nowhere, sits in the field, and moves from place to place. I personally believe it's just the hicks that move it to scare locals. Seriously, the rednecks that live out there are creepy enough, it wouldn't surprise me. The second is the ghostly figure of a ratted out old man in farmer's clothing, tarnished and sunken. Again, although I am a strong believer in the paranormal, I personally debunk this as one of the many homeless people that take shelter along the road. My first time down the lane was nothing more than a 7-minute drive at around 2 a.m., without any exciting discoveries or anything particularly strange. Because of the cold, damp weather and being surrounded by marsh fields, the fog on Silent Hill was thick. If something walked out in front of the car, we'd hit it before we saw it. During this drive, Blake explained to me the different histories and rumors. Our friend, we'll call him Chris, was the one driving. The only thing we noticed our first time was what looked like someone coming out to get their mail from one of the small farmhouses, as they were holding a lighter. It was hard to see anything but a figure in the small light. We thought nothing of it, even with the creepy atmosphere. Our second drive was during the day. Around 2 p.m. the drive was much nicer, and I actually enjoyed the scenery. There were many cows in the fields on either side of the lane, and the overhanging trees were less creepy. The warm feeling ended quickly. When we approached the second turn, where the farmhouses began, we passed 3 large blue tarps near where we saw the figure with their lighter in the gutter. Now, I'm not usually one to go peeking through trash. But it wasn't trash. Chris pulled over, and it was only Blake, and I eagerly got out just to lean over and take a look while he stayed in the car. To keep it short, they were dead dogs. 3 large farm dogs, I think maybe retrievers. I didn't take pictures. And to keep it even shorter, we left pretty quick. I don't know much more about how they died or why. I'll leave it at that. My third and most recent visit, around November 2nd, was my last for now and the only striking drive thus far. We decided, as a fun idea, to go down the lane at 3 a.m. I explained the origins of why the hour was associated with bad spirits, auras, and feelings. I personally do not believe that 3 a.m. is the witching hour entirely. At first, there was nothing. Blake was on his phone in the back seat while I was up in the front next to Chris. There were no cars behind us during the entire drive. At some point during the stretch before the first turn, a flash happened behind the car, just outside of the window, 2 times. We figured that there was a car behind us, and their lights were passing over the small bumps in the road. After the first turn, however, we noticed there were no vehicles behind us. Blake then decided to turn off his phone completely and set it into the cup holder, making sure it wasn't him. Another flash happened after that, behind the car. Then, after the third turn, one was directly outside of my window. As we approached the last turn, Blake suddenly made a loud screaming sound, causing Chris to panic and honk his horn accidentally. I started to yell, obviously, because that's way uncalled for, especially when it's so dangerous to act out on a road like this. And I'm sure Blake was just ducking around when he said, "I saw something run next to the car." Because obviously it was nothing, though I wasn't looking to see it. To this day, though, he still holds on to it. Chris was pissed. I want to know what those lights could have been. I want to know if anyone has had similar experiences or if they can tell me anything more about Dyer Lane, if I should go back, if it's all a hoax, or if it's not even interesting. This isn't some ridiculous demon story, I know, and it's not particularly scary. I just wanted to share and see what I could find. Anyway, I have had this thing following me since I was about 12. Long story short, my family and I were on a vacation in the forest near the Red River, as I believe it's called. It's been some time since this happened. The setting was a cabin near the Red River. My parents and most of my cousins were down fishing to catch some breakfast while my cousins J, A, and I stayed behind to play war or some other child's card game. While we waited for a few houses at the cabin, I remember hearing something outside. Thinking it was my family returning, I got up to look out the living room window to see a pretty large figure in the trees, maybe 40 yards away. Trying to see past the trees and lack of full sunlight, since the sun had not yet cleared the mountains in the distance, I saw what looked like a pretty beefy man wearing a deer skull. When I say man, I wouldn't say that, more of a body with deer legs, a mange-ridden man's chest, and arms with a skull on top. Not just a skull, though, like some skeleton, but someone wearing a skull. As I looked at whatever this thing was, I noticed the cabin, or suddenly took an interest in it, and looked in our direction. At this time, I dove under the windowsill and told my cousin that something was outside. As they both started to walk over to me and look out the window, a large crash or bang happened on the wooden porch. It sounded like someone threw a sack of bricks on the porch. So now that all 3 of us were attempting to hide under the windowsill, we could hear something walking on the porch and stopping to look in each window at the front of the house. Soon, whatever it was started banging on the side of the cabin hard enough to make some preteens cry. This kept going on for a few moments until it was silent, and soon I heard what sounded like my mother's voice calling out, "Let me have my hands full." As I looked directly up from my position under the windowsill, I could see its face or the skull mask that covered it. There were strange markings all over it, and it looked like it was charred or burned at some point, looking cracked and scorched. After a few attempts, the protest became more violent, with people screaming for us to let her in, but we all knew it clearly wasn't her. A few moments later, we could hear laughter and our family walking up the hill from the pond that was below the cabin. The protests and banging from the thing stopped, and I could hear it leave the porch and start to walk away from the cabin. Once I knew it was away from the cabin, I looked out the window to see where the thing had gone, worried that my family might be walking up on something that would hurt them. I saw the thing fast, pacing its way back into the trees. Its back seemed hunched, so I couldn't see the front of it at this point, but I did see a full view of its backside, deer legs or some animal of the sort, torso as described before, but its hands were something I didn't see. They were extremely long and bony, with visibly long yellow and black fingernails or claws. There was also a black stripe with markings on the side of it running the length of its spine. As it furthered into the woods and our family came into view from the hill, it stopped and looked back at me for a moment before starting a run, disappearing deeper into the woods and out of sight. My family returned, and of course we tried to tell them about this, but you know how that goes. My cousins still remember the incident, and we still talk about it during the holidays when we see each other. Now that was odd, yeah, but the thing is, since then I have been having dreams that are only dark and shit. I can't remember the last time I had a night with more than 4 hours of sleep. But also, things have been happening that even my ex, friends, and even my current girlfriend notice. Shadow people, forms of sleep paralysis, a shadowy deer-headed figure standing in the corner of the room in the middle of the night while we sleep, or in dark places such as camping, alleyways, and so on. None of these people have told me about my experiences until after they see the figure with the deer skull. So there is no way for them to have it in their brain to be seeing things. The figure has also shown up in my dreams with family members of friends, has only happened a handful of times but freaks me out, because every time that thing is in a dream with that person, they have died or been injured badly within the next day after the dream. Examples are 2 high school friends dying the day after a dream, one to a car crash, the other to going missing while hiking to have bones found later in the woods, assumedly attacked by a bear. My ex's mother died the day after I had a dream about her, and the thing was, she died from a stomach cancer she never knew she had. And my ex almost died from being hit head-on while on a country road highway by a drunk driver. Her Chevy Avalanche was absolutely destroyed, and she walked away with no injuries. A few days before, my grandmother passed down a Scottish protection charm that has been in my family for generations. Call me superstitious, but I think it saved her. Anyway, this thing has been in my life since then, and I'm not the only one to see it. But people only see it when they are with me. Does anyone have any idea what it might be? I've been trying to look into demons that take that form, so someone said this creature reminds them of Leshy from Slavic myth. He is the protector of the woods, he can take various forms. But probably that wasn't Leshy, he is neutral relative to people until you mess with his forest, and I bet you are not from a slave country. So, more likely, it was a Wendigo or skinwalker. They can look similar to your description and also mimic the voices of people to lure their victims. So I recently moved in with my grandmother, and as I was exploring my old stomping grounds, where I used to roam as a kid, I found a place that was by far one of the most chilling paranormal experiences I've had in my life. So a little background context on this place. So there's this park about a 5-minute walk from her house. There's this park that's maybe 100 feet from a river that runs down the middle of my home state. This park has been the scene of many drownings and other deaths. Most of the children were unsupervised by their parents. Anyway, this park kind of became a local legend in the town. Some say there's a dark entity, others say it's La Linra anyway, so one day me and a couple of my friends decided to sneak out one night to smoke and drink. I'm 21 now, so we planned to meet at the park around 11:30 at night. So as I left the house, it was a hot July night, typical for a Midwestern desert state. As I reached the park, though, I couldn't help but notice that it was cold and foggy. And a sudden chill was in the air that seemed to be creeping up from the banks of the river. I met up with my friends, and we began to have a little party. Me and about 6 or 7 others were smoking and having a great time. Me and one girl were planning on sneaking off from the others when we heard a scream and then splashing sounds. At first, we thought it was just someone fooling around until we heard it again. This time, the screams were louder and more chilling. We looked at the others, and everyone was there, and no one was missing. We all looked out at the river, hoping to see where it was coming from. But the water was clear. The screams became louder, as if they were all around us. Screams of help echoed all around us, but we couldn't find the bodies of these screams. We all decided to run from the park to one of my friends' cars. We all got in, and as we drove off, I looked back and swore I said at least 10 shadows. All the tall children were standing along the bank of the river, with one larger shadow behind them. To this day, I can't even drive by the park without a cold chill running down my spine. Later on in life, I researched who all died in that park, and there have been reports of children drowning in the river dating back to at least the early 1920s. What I want to know is who or what that larger shadow was. So this isn't something I've had hands-on experience with, but stories passed down from my grandparents, on my dad's side. My dad's family has been living here in this village for almost 50 years. My country is really small. I live in Trinidad, which is an island in the Caribbean, and as a people, we hold high beliefs in the paranormal, etc., so it's not uncommon to have your brothers and sisters living on the same street. Our house is located on the corner of an intersection. Keep in mind that this is a village, so there's a back road, and the intersecting road isn't even a road, it's a dusty trail, and there's not much development aside from the actual houses, so the rest of the area is deep foliage. So this story involves my home, the 3 neighbors across from us, 2 right next to each other are brothers, and then there's the house next to ours across the trail and the house opposite that, and the house behind that one, so it kind of forms a disfigured circle. Long before I was born and my dad and his sisters were really young, the old lady's husband from across the street got sick and died. This is a Hindu family that participated in blood sacrifices. It was assumed they used black magic to acquire their wealth, so when he died, his spirit couldn't leave the earth. My grandmother said every night after his passing, she could hear stuff like dishes and bricks being thrown around and destroyed, but when she went over to see what was wrong, the kitchen was spotless. It was after this occurred a couple times that they figured it was his restless spirit and decided to hold the funeral earlier than planned to lay him to rest. On the night of his funeral, his wife almost died as well because, as she leaned over his coffin, something began choking her and pulling her down into it. They got her out, of course, but then his spirit, or whatever it was, began moving things around. The potted plants rearranged themselves, the chairs stacked together, and the doors of the house blew open. Now personally, I would have left and let them deal with that, but because our people are so superstitious, it didn't really affect any of them, so they stayed and continued on with the proceedings. Later, my grandma would tell me she had experienced much more paranormal things in her life, so that didn't even faze her. After the funeral, things died down until my grandfather's sister-in-law, who lived in the house across from us, which is now occupied by the son of the restless spirit, started seeing spirits, specifically a tall, naked man of African descent. She saw him multiple times, but she was always alone at night when it happened. He'd stand in the doorway to her bedroom and just stare at her, and sometimes she said there'd be a white coffin floating at the foot of her bed and he'd be lying inside it. She passed away soon after without ever resolving the cause of her hallucinations, but I've heard mumblings among the Indian women in our family that it was a symbol, a warning that her husband was having an affair, but she died without finding out the truth. Then there's the story of the mango tree in the lot to our left. The people who lived there at the time were simply tenants renting from an old woman who allegedly killed her husband in the house and hid his body in an old metal bunker in the backyard. She had a lot of animals in her yard, pigs, chickens, ducks, etc., and so the smell of all the feces would cover the stench of her rotting spouse. When anybody asked her about him, she simply said they got a divorce and he went back to England. He was a white man, she was an Indian, and nobody questioned it because all people would do back in that time was simply gossip about the causes and move on when they got bored. Rumor has it that his body completely decayed in that bunker and that he continues to haunt the home, and since a new family moved into the house, and customary to Caribbean folk, who blessed the home before moving in, he couldn't stay in there and instead occupied the mango tree in the backyard. I was around 6 at this time, and my dad and I would go out and look up at the tree because there was a large, shadowy circle in the middle of it, and no matter how much light shone down through the leaves, we couldn't see anything. Now the tree is gone, of course, but it still feels like something lives there because of the ever-present shadow that hovers over that house. Now for my house and the house behind the one across the street, my grandfather's brother lived there. My grandparents always saw apparitions. We gave her a legend in the Caribbean about a woman with the foot of a cow called La Diablesse, the devil woman. She's said to be the most beautiful woman ever and would lure men by stopping them as they drove by to ask for a ride, and she'd always sit in the back seat. When the men arrived at whatever destination she requested, they'd look in the mirror to find that she was gone. Then she would haunt them by appearing in her true form and tormenting them constantly until they took their own lives or she caused their deaths in some sort of accident. My grandparents would see this woman roaming the streets with her chain dragging behind her as she sought out her next victims, and sometimes she'd stare right back at that in the dark of night. They'd also hear horses running through the trail next to our house, hoofs pounding relentlessly, but as soon as they stepped outside to see, they would vanish. There would also be a spirit that would choke my grandfather in his sleep. He'd be trashing and crying in his sleep, and my grandmother would have to shake him until he woke up. All these things have been happening gradually over the past 40 years, and everyone who marries into the family has also been able to see and hear these paranormal things. I've never had any serious encounters with the paranormal, apart from seeing people in shadows where there are none and hearing noises that should not be heard. It's never scared me at all, maybe because I grew up hearing these stories and was surrounded by myths and folklore all my life, so it all seems normal, but one thing I can guarantee is that something plagues the village I live in. It was here 40 years ago, and it's still here now. This happened in Colorado Springs on Gold Camp Road. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, you know that this place is a hotspot for urban legends and creepy ghost stories. The road is located on the side of a mountain and has several large tunnels dug through the mountain that you have to drive through to get to the end of the road. It's mostly used to get to scenic routes that overlook the city and hiking trails. There are also all sorts of scary stories that I'm sure you've heard if you grew up in the area. The story goes that a bus full of small children crashed within one of the tunnels after it partially collapsed, and the spirits of those children are trapped in the tunnel. Supposedly, if you drive into the tunnel at night and come to a stop, turn your lights out, and put baby powder or flour on your windshield, little ghostly hands will smear the powder all around. Also, and I'm not sure if this story has any validity to it, I've been told a lot of people dump bodies over the side of the road. The cliffs and heavy wilderness apparently make it a good place to hide evidence. Anyway, this was all bullshit to me. I would drive the Goldcamp Road about once a week during the summer, as it was a beautiful night drive to take with friends, and there are several pullover spots to smoke pot with relative certainty that you will not encounter any police. Anyway, my friend, 21F, and I spent about an hour one night smoking, walking around the scenic spots, and playing music until about 3 or 4 a.m. again. We had been doing this exact routine all summer and were used to the dark, creepy tunnels and the heavy woods at night. And this particular night was no different. That was until we started ascending to the peak. I'm not sure how to describe the feeling of getting to a certain point on the mountain, but it felt like a distinct passing over. There was a specific moment, and I remember feeling that we were in a completely different location. It was kind of like the moment in Spirited Away when all the spirits come out at night in the city in the beginning. It was like nothing was there and we were alone, and suddenly it just felt extremely populated. We couldn't see anything, and it was still dark, but it was like there was energy all around us. It was like the sensation of being in a loud crowd without anything physically happening. I started to feel really uneasy, and my friend told me she was getting a little creeped out. I told her it was okay, we were almost to the second tunnel, and then we would descend. We entered the tunnel, and the headlines lit up everything to the end. That's when I saw it. A very distinct, clear as day little boy was standing just to the right of the tunnel, almost touching the wall. He didn't look exactly like a real boy that would be standing there. Instead, he looked like an overexposed film photograph of a little boy. My friend and I both gasped, and I slammed the brakes dramatically, and then, just like that, it was gone. In Ireland, you're never far from the sea. I'm very used to my proximity to the water in a way that I imagine many of you aren't due simply to geography. I was born on the north coast of Ireland, technically in Northern Ireland, near Ballycastle, a small town up there. Like most coastal towns, our part of the world comes alive in the summer with people from all over, but in the winter, it is quite barren and isolated. Unlike most people, it was at that time of the year, beginning in late autumn and running through to the middle of spring, that I enjoyed the sea most. There's something quite special about having access to sprawling beaches when most people don't bother to give them a chance. Even on dull days, the roar of the sea in all its expanse calms me, particularly at dawn and dusk when the light of the sky makes the water glimmer with a mystery that I can't characterize. My story begins and ends with the sea. Before I really begin, I'd like to give you a brief rundown of Selkie, or Silkie, lore. Selkies are a type of being who, legend has it, inhabit the seas around the northern British Isles, although they can be traced as far as Iceland. The sea north of Ireland is inhabited by seals, and it isn't uncommon to see a colony of seals, or perhaps an individual, further out from the towns. I don't know if there exists an animal more charming than a seal, with its lively bark and its smiling face, so like that of a human. The Selkie takes the form of a seal but is really a being with the ability to remove its coat and take on a human-like form. Traditionally, tales speak of Selkies appearing as beautiful women, but if you delve deep into folklore, Selkies appear in all kinds of human forms. Legend has it that they appear in groups on moonlit beaches at certain times during the year, far from human eyes. Here they will remove their seal coats and take on their human bodies, dancing with jubilance to music under the light of the moon before eventually returning to the sea. It sounds like a very innocent myth, but there is a darker side to the story. Ireland isn't a large country, and relatively speaking, you can never be too far from humanity and civilization. If misfortune strikes and a human catches sight of a group of Selkies, they will dart to their coats and make their way back to the sea without hesitation. If, however, the human takes hold of one of the coats, their skin, then the Selkie is bound to him. The Selkie cannot return home without this. Consequently, stories tell of men taking Selkies as wives, keeping the seal skin hidden away. The Selkie will never stop longing for its home and family, but will be trapped in the home of their captor for the remainder of their lives unless they are able to recapture their lost coat. Most would never succeed in doing so. Like most myths, I would have always taken Selkies with a pinch of salt. That is, until I was 17, and I had my own experience that really is unexplainable unless we place some credence on Selkie lore. As I say, I was born on the coast, just outside of town. Teenage life can be challenging for anyone, but for me, this was amplified by being a queer person in a very small community. It wasn't easy, but I found some solace in nature, which, as I said, provided me with headspace at a time when I needed it more than anything. Ironically, the best tonic for my sense of isolation was isolation, a self-built isolation on those evenings when I could walk the 10 minutes to the beach and enjoy the setting sun, which made the water glisten with hope and that unexplainable sense of mystery. I spent hours down there, particularly on those cold days when contact with other people would be minimal. Mostly, there wouldn't be much to say about these evenings. I would walk and walk and walk, and eventually I would begin to switch off. Not terribly exciting, but steady and constant. There was one evening, however, when my path took a different turn. There was a section of the beach that was somewhat shrouded by dunes and rocks, a quiet cove a few miles down from the side of the beach I started at. We were deep in spring at this point. I know this because I could never have made it this far along the sand in the winter months, when daylight was minimal. I was trying to maximize my time here before the tourist season began and the area would begin to fill with people from all over. On the beach, I was struck by the sight of what looked like a young man. The light was beginning to dim, and the sea had a purpley hue. He was strewn out on the sand, his form slender and somehow gentle. It would have been somewhat unusual to see someone this far out along the beach at this time of year, but not altogether shocking. What was shocking was that he was entirely naked, with not a single item of clothing in sight, either on his body or on the sand. I'll inform you now that although winter has ended, an Irish spring is hardly warm. It isn't rare for snow to fall as late as March and April, and the wind, particularly by the sea, is biting and at times relentless. You can understand my shock upon seeing this naked figure on the beach that day. What made it more bewildering was that his body appeared to glimmer. It was as though he was formed from a matter related to the sea before us, which gleamed in much the same way. His pale skin imitated its hue, moving softly with the sun to create something that transfixed me. Ordinarily, I'd have been deeply embarrassed by anything related to nudity or sex. I was an awkward 17-year-old from rural Ireland. But this was different. In the same way that the sea at this time of day calmed me and soothed me, it was as though he had inspired the same effect, though somehow magnified. I lost track of the time spent in that spot. I'm embarrassed to write now that I stood staring at what I thought was a naked man for any amount of time, but I can only be honest. And then it was over. He opened his eyes suddenly and appeared to become stiff in a way that contrasted with his relaxed form until then. I saw him turn his eyes to me, which widened in shock. These eyes, I remember, were striking even from a slight distance. They were gray, but startlingly so, almost sinking into the whiteness that surrounded them like watercolor and piercing despite the lack of hue. His entire form was one pale, glistening shape that melded together and appeared translucent in the dimming light. He quickly and soundlessly rose to his feet and moved with sharp fluidity to the rocks behind him. Still frozen, I watched as he emerged from the rocks carrying what looked like a silvery piece of cloth, which matched his own body. I say cloth, but it did not move in the wind, which was blowing in from the sea. It seemed solid and heavy, but he carried it effortlessly to the sea at a fast pace, his eyes staring intently at me the entire time. When he reached the sea, he stepped into the water with his coat and buried himself in the waves. And then he was gone. At this, I shook myself back to life and moved towards the shore myself. As much as I tried, I could not make out his form anywhere. He had vanished into the roaring water, soundlessly and without any physical trace. I was bemused but exhilarated. I remained there for around 10 minutes more before making my way home, the images of the evening etched into my mind for the duration of the walk, which was guided by the light of the now fully risen moon. My parents were frustrated when I reached my house, upset that I had been out for much longer than they had expected, but their words seemed to drift over my head. I was quiet as a teenager, and I imagine it wasn't surprising to them that I didn't have much to say, no matter their frustration. I didn't speak to anyone at the time about what I had encountered that evening. Being a bit of an outcast already, I hardly wanted to appear even odder, and it would be a few years before I really found a group of friends with whom I could mull these thoughts over. I did, however, spend the next few weeks burying myself in online literature about anything that might have been connected to the image of the figure on the beach. I came across Selkie stories and immersed myself in Selkie lore. Although it didn't entirely match what I had seen, it was the only myth I could find that was somewhat similar. I returned to that part of the beach many times, especially in the summer, when daylight was much more generous. It saddened me then that I never came across the being I had seen that night. On one occasion, however, I had resigned myself to walking back home when I heard a bark coming from the shore. I was delighted to see 3 silvery seals in the water, a few meters out into the sea. They moved playfully, their voices filling the air. It struck me that one, a little smaller than the other 2, was looking at me watchfully, its small eyes intent. The light of the setting sun hit its body, which sparkled with its rays, and I smiled back, waving slightly. I don't know if this was the being I had seen that evening some months before. It may have been, or it may just have been an ordinary, albeit beautiful, seal. What I do know is that I didn't want to disturb him or frighten him, so after waving, I began my walk home. I pray that, whoever or whatever he was, he knows now that I meant no harm to him when I encountered him enjoying the evening light on the cove. Rather, I would love to be able to communicate to him how much seeing him meant to me and how much peace it brought to my mind to see one other creature enjoying the glory and beauty of nature on a spring evening in Ireland. Well, I'm going to mention some from Brazilian folklore, as it's my country. There's the Mapinguari, a 2-meter-tall humanoid creature covered in red fur, with only one eye, long arms, claws, and a big mouth with sharp teeth on its belly. He makes a lot of noise, tears down trees, and anything else in its path. It always kills its prey, and it's always hungry. The boitata is a giant fire snake, protector of the forest, and we have a lot of those. Some say it can turn into a fiery tree to attract its victims and burn them. It also makes anyone who sees it go blind and mad. But it also depends on the version. The curupira is a short man, covered in hair, who protects the forests. He's got his feet facing in the opposite direction, so he can trick hunters who try to follow its tracks into getting lost in the woods. The mula sem cabeça, or headless mule, is a cursed spirit of a woman who has a relationship with a priest. It has a burning fire for a head. The caipora is another protector of the woods and animals. She is a small woman also covered in hair. She rides some type of swine-like creature, and she hunts down hunters who didn't comply with the terms of their agreement. And hanga is a malevolent spirit from Tupi mythology. It sometimes appears as a white deer. It tortures the living and prevents the dead from reaching the afterlife, and it was associated with the devil by Christian priests. There's also the pisadira, represented as a very thin woman with long, dirty fingers, short legs, messy hair, and red eyes. During the night, she steps on top of people sleeping, depriving them of air, while she stares them down, cackling. Ghost light of Pactolus. First off, this is all 100% true and based on my own personal experiences. My folks live in eastern North Carolina. The town in which they live has a neighboring town that plays host to a local legend and a paranormal presence. The town is called Pactolus, which sounds like something straight out of H.P. Lovecraft, and is about as small as a town can get. It's mostly just farms, with a few businesses and schools along the semi-major road that runs through it. Pactolus itself is very unremarkable. However, down one back road along farmland, there is an entrance to an old farm use road. This dirt road runs across fields blocked in by paved roads, one end meeting the paved road but gated off with just enough room for a car to park in front of the gate, and the other end running into someone's backyard. It is completely unlit, as far as I know, unused, and off of a little used road that just kind of cuts a corner between the town's more important roads. There's no house off of this road. The road is flanked by crop fields on both sides, with a thick tree line enclosing it. You could sit there all day and see 2 cars go by. Legend says the dirt road used to be train tracks, with some stories about a gentleman being jumped and killed while waiting on his wife from the train. There are a few different versions of the story. In each, though, this guy gets killed, and ever since, you can supposedly park your car in front of the gate, flash your lights 3 times, and wait. After a short period, a light will flash back, or the glow of a swinging lantern will appear down the dirt road. I say supposedly, but the thing is, I have now been to this spot 6 times, and every time without fail, I have had an experience. The first few times we followed the ritual of the legend, but since then we have found that the phenomenon works without any headlight flashing at all. It seems to be present at all times. As for the light itself, in the first few visits, we saw a white flash, almost like someone down the path turned on a flashlight for a split second. This light doesn't illuminate anything else around it. It seems to be a light in appearance but not in function. Later visits made the light act differently. It would flash at different distances down the road or even at different heights, sometimes about halfway up the height of a tree. Eventually, it would start to flash different colors. The light typically isn't scary in any way, but after a handful of normal white flashes, we have seen it flash yellow and a really deep, menacing red. The most disturbing thing I've seen is the light change to a pair of lights side by side, almost like eyes, flashing bright red and moving side to side. This convinced us that it was time to leave that particular night. But, never failing, every single time I have visited this spot, the light has flashed, usually several times and sometimes up to about 10 times with a few minutes in between. Now, a lot of people might think this is just a hoax. There are a lot of reasons why I don't think it can be. This place is really in the middle of nowhere, and it isn't visited often. There's no house or anything that someone could see cars coming from and running out of. The light flashes at different heights and different distances, meaning someone would have to have an intricate system rigged up or be running around like crazy out there. Several people, including a local paranormal investigation team, have walked down the road and found no sign of any kind of setup. It goes over a slight hill, so you can't see the other end at all. In fact, you can only see maybe 50 yards down the road clearly. There's no mirror or anything else set up. The ways in which the light changes would be tough to create, and it doesn't take any kind of obvious shape or form that a hoaxer might use to try and scare people. We've been out there at some odd times. We went one Thanksgiving night at about 11 o'clock in the cold rain. I find it hard to believe that someone would be sitting out in the middle of nowhere to flash lights on someone's Thanksgiving night. The light is a local legend, but it's not commercialized at all. There's no gift shop or merchandise. The closest thing to that is a microbrewery that names a beer after it. As regular and predictable as this thing is, if someone was hoaxing it, you'd think there would be some attempt to get something out of it. If anything, the people who live around there probably want their peace and quiet. Attracting people to their area in the middle of the night is not something they'd sign up for. This thing has also been going on for decades. If someone was faking it, they must have passed down the tradition to someone else by now. It just seems like if it were a hoax, someone would either know about it or have found something proving it by now. Weirdly, and most profoundly for me, the light seems to appear differently to different viewers at the same time. I've seen the light as plain as day and had someone with me not see it at all. I've seen it white, and they have said they saw it red. I've gone stretches of staring down this road waiting and not seeing anything while my company keeps saying they saw the light. So if it's a hoax, it's a person that is camping out by a road in the middle of nowhere, even in the rain at 11 o'clock Thanksgiving night, with elaborate lighting equipment that somehow makes those lights appear differently to different people, and who is seeking no reward for their efforts and has never been caught or ratted out by someone. The light is only about 15 minutes from my parents' house, so every time I'm down there, I feel the need to go see it and try to learn more about it. I've always been a fan of the paranormal, so having something like this that gives me an experience literally every time I visit it is incredible. I can't help but feel like I'm drawn to it in some way. We have had a few times that we've tried to stop and there's already a car there. Once there was a truck full of kids drinking there. That kind of goes to show how secluded this area is. I always leave feeling super disappointed when this happens. My most recent visit was actually this past Friday, on the way home from another Thanksgiving. Things got pretty weird. My fiancé and I left my parents when it was already dark out, and the light was on the way home, so we figured why not stop by on the way? This was about 6:30. I hadn't been able to make it the last couple of times I've been to my parents' house, so I was pretty excited to have a new experience. It was a creepy night, a little cloudy with a bright orange full moon. We pulled onto the dirt road and parked. A car passed behind us, which was the only other car we saw while we were there. About 5 minutes later, the light flashed bright white. I exclaimed that I had seen it, but my fiancée said that she had not. A few minutes later, it flashed again with the same results. After this flash, we talked about how the road was really hard to focus on. It wasn't a pitch black night, so after a few minutes, our eyes had adjusted and we could see for a decent distance. But, when looking down the road, things were blurry, fuzzy, and seemed to shift around somewhat. She then said she could vaguely see what looked to her like 3 tall, shadowy figures that moved periodically down the road. There was a lapse of a few minutes between flashes, so we decided to try the fabled headlights method. With the road lit up, it looked totally different than it did in the dark, and it was plain to see that there wasn't anyone there. Another few minutes went by, and this is where things started acting differently than they ever had for me before. While staring down the road, I watched our whole windshield flash a few shades lighter. I looked around to see if a car was coming that might have lit up the inside of our car, but there was not. My fiancée again said she was seeing what looked like shadowy figures moving and also faintly glowing orb-type shapes. The light then flashed down the road again, and this time she saw it as well. The next time the light flashed, I noticed that I could see a faintly glowing spot that built in intensity until it, the best word I can think of is popped with a flash. The spot would glow for a few seconds before each flash, and it occurred in different spots around the same tree. From this point on, I was able to accurately predict when and where the light would flash based on this glow. My fiancée could not see this and saw the light every now and then, but still not every time. The second time the light flashed after I started seeing the glow, it flashed white and then yellow right afterwards. At this point, we decided to start asking questions out loud and trying to document what we experienced. We admittedly watched too many ghost adventures. We didn't get any audible responses or get anything recorded, even though I had my phone camera aimed down the road when the light flashed one time. We asked things like if this was the spirit of a person, if it was something else, if it liked visitors, etc. After our little question session, I watched as a glowing turquoise shape streaked down the length of the same tree that I had been seeing the flashes around. It moved in a zigzag pattern, like lightning, but fairly slowly, and was a wide line. It glowed faintly like a glow-in-the-dark toy that was running out of glow. Right after this shape faded away, the light flashed below the tree again, this time white, then yellow, then the same deep red we had seen in the past. It streaked to the left as it flashed. My friend did see the light this time, and again, the red color gave us a really foreboding feeling. We asked one more question, if whatever it was wanted us to leave. Right after this, I watched as two lights flashed side by side, like a pair of eyes, again white, then yellow, then deep red. These lights seemed closer to us and moved to the right. The red eyes stayed for nearly a full second. I was shocked and said something like, "OSHT, that seems bad," to which my fiancée reacted with confusion as she hadn't seen the lights this time. We decided it was time to go. As we drove away, we both felt pressure in our heads, and she had tightness around her neck, which gave her some serious anxiety. This did pass after a few moments, thankfully. The night after, at about 5 a.m., I woke up feeling weird, in kind of that not really awake state where everything is fuzzy. I got up to get a glass of water. On my way back to bed, the pattern of a blanket on our couch looked like eyes staring at me, like the eyes of an owl. My first reaction was that it was one of our cats, which it wasn't, and after a couple seconds, it kind of morphed back into the blanket. I saw a similar thing out of the corner of my eye that morning, and I had moments of chills and feeling watched the day after. I'm inclined to blame tiredness and excitement from the experience, but who knows? It all seems to have passed after a few days. So what the heck is this that we're experiencing? To me, I get the feeling that this is something very old, something not human. I feel that whatever this phenomenon is has been in this spot for a long, long time, and the stories have been made up around it. I think it's an area where energies gather, allowing something that otherwise couldn't express itself. Maybe it's a spot where the edges between dimensions are thin. The reliability of having an experience here, now 6 out of 6 times for me, is just crazy. It shocks me that this isn't a popular spot for paranormal investigators. It seems like this presence could be a means of proving that something we can't explain exists. I call it a light, as that is what it looks like, but I don't think that's entirely accurate. It doesn't light up the environment around it at all. The fact that it didn't show up on video in the dark of night is another proof that this isn't as light as we think of it. If a light switched on, my camera would surely have picked it up as it desperately searched for something to focus on. Instead, we saw it with our eyes but recorded only darkness. Is it actually interacting with us, or is that just us humanizing it? It did seem to get more varied in its expression the longer we were there, but there's no sign it really cared about or reacted to our questions, let alone evidence that it's sentient and, if so, can hear us at all. I wonder what would have happened had we stayed longer, or if I had the nerve to stay past that imposing pair of red eyes next time. I'd love to know if anyone knows of other areas that have similar phenomena, especially those that are as active as this one. Any ideas what the colors of the lights mean? We are thinking about looking into some ghost hunting equipment for next time so we can try to get more answers. The Aswang is the Filipino version of the boogeyman. There are many types, from ghosts to mythological creatures to shapeshifters, depending on the stories. My experience happened when I was 9 to 11 years old. My mom and my 2 brothers, 7 and 2, sleep in one bed. I woke up in the middle of the night. I sat up. I was holding a throw pillow, no blanket, my right eye was covered while my left eye was open. What I saw shocked me. There were 2 women sitting on the bed. One I saw as clear as day, while the other was obstructed by my pillow. The woman had messy hair, and the skin was kind of wrinkly, like a lizard, and maybe gray in color. They were just sitting there very still, not moving, but not staring at me. I slowly lie down on the bed. As I was already lying on the bed, they started to move close to me. I must have felt her skin because my foot felt something that was cold and had the soft texture of a diaper. I inched my way away from them, and they also inched their way closer to me. I kept moving away from them until I hit the corner wall. Our bed was in the corner of the room, and I thought to myself, I'm ducked. Now I didn't have a blanket. All I had was that throw pillow. I used it to cover my face. What happened next freaked me out. I heard a weird sound while they were doing something to my hair. I don't know if they were running their hands through my hair, but the sound seemed to go with it. At the time, I thought they were biting my hair and letting it run through their teeth. That sound I heard is like the sound when you scratch your arm, but in long, fast strokes. Then my mom must have sleep-talked because she yells out, "Get away from here, you bad spirits." Then it stopped. I mustered up all my courage to open my eyes and see that they weren't around. I saw my brother had a blanket on, and I grabbed it. The blanket was wrapped tight around my brother. I pulled as much as I could, and I only got about a foot of blanket to cover myself with. Now this blanket was skin tight on me. I started praying to myself. Then the freakiness starts again. I feel hands all over me, up and down my body, all the while hearing that scratching sound. I didn't sleep at all that night, and it felt like an eternity in that skin-tight blanket. I was so relieved when morning came. I told my mom about it, and she didn't believe me, even though I was shaking from fear. The next night, I slept close to my mom, and I wanted the lamp to be left on, but she didn't want to. Later on that night, we heard flapping sounds. Really loud flapping sounds. There must have been 2 or 3 entities making those sounds. When the flapping stopped, my mom turned on the lights and told me to go to sleep with my grandpa. Because those flapping sounds could have come from a Menehune. My grandpa's room scared me even more because his window was only covered by bamboo, and it's a big window. My grandpa tells me not to cover myself with a blanket, that I shouldn't be afraid, and that I should yell back at it to leave me alone. As I was trying to go to sleep, I started to hear voices. I asked my grandpa if he heard it too, and he said no. The voice was that of a man whispering a phrase over and over again, Tulog na mga bata, which literally translates to sleep now, children. Morning came, and my mom believed what I was afraid of at night. Nighttime always scared me. Every night, I'd wake up feeling cold and warm at the same time. There was this one time I felt something weird touching or biting my legs. Like how you fold your lips over your teeth and try to bite yourself. I would get vivid nightmares, and I'd be moving really, really slowly in them. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with someone, maybe my brother, sleeping next to me, but when I turned on the flashlight I'm holding, they'd move away. There was this one time my mom and I woke up in the middle of the night. The power had gone out. Our room is at the end of the hallway, and we keep the door open all the time. Our bed is situated so that you can see down the hallway. Well, on this particular night, we heard a loud click. Someone or something turned on the gas range. I could see the fire flicker down the hallway. Next, we heard footsteps, dancing footsteps. It was as if there were people dancing to the fire. They accidentally knocked down a cup, stopped for a while, and started dancing again. My mom had the house blessed, but it still continued. And there was this one time when someone sleeping next to me sat up and immediately ran out of the room. I was thinking that the Awang might have seen daylight and scurried out of the house, even though I didn't hear the front door or back door open and close. Another one was when one of my grandmas came to visit, and out of the blue she asked me if I wanted to sleep over at her house. That was the only time I slept through the night until morning without interruption. My mom had a witch doctor check me out. The witch doctor told my mom to watch over me next week, Tuesday and Thursday, because they were going to take me away. Everyone in the house stayed up all night on Tuesday but did nothing on Thursday, as nothing eventful happened on those dates. This happened for 2 years. The first year was rough, the second was not so much. I'd only wake up in the middle of the night with someone lying next to me, not be there in the morning. It wasn't until 8 years later that my sister told me that an Awang must have seen me and had a liking for me. We'd go rollerblading in a subdivision down the road from our house. It stopped when we returned to live in Guam. From my understanding, this Awang might be a regular person, but with supernatural powers or something, and her influence couldn't reach me from over 1,000 miles away. I think I sound crazy when talking to people outside of my family about knocks at night. There's that myth or legend, not sure what to call it, that 3 knocks on a door while you sleep mean death is coming. Some boil it down to exploding head syndrome. I think we are connected like radios with frequencies. My first experience was when I was 18. I was asleep in my barracks. 3 loud knocks woke me up. I opened my door, and no one was there. I went back to sleep. Same thing. It happened a few times before I figured someone was messing with me, so I stayed awake, looked out my window, and even went outside to yell at someone. No one was in sight. I figured I'd ignore them and just put my headphones on. Then 3 frantic knocks came again, louder and from my closest. I ran out of my barracks like a lunatic. No one was in my barracks or near my room. Exactly 1 week later, my grandma died of a broken spirit. I had no idea about the 3 knocks and was really confused. Several months pass, and 3 knock again. This time, I'm more annoyed. They had different energy and only knocked the first 3 times. I ignored them. Exactly 1 week later, my grandpa died alone. Next year, I hear 3 knocks. These ones are a little more faint and nowhere near as frantic as the first time, a little further apart from the second time. I ignored the knocks and went back to sleep. Exactly 1 week later, my stepbrother died of odd. I am still not piecing these knocks together. I went without hearing any knocks until I was 23. I was out of military service by then and had a house in a new neighborhood. 3 knocks woke me up. They were soft but loud enough to be heard from the front room to my bedroom. My dog was asleep, and I went and looked through the eye hole in the front door. No one was there. This time, I started freaking out inside. I remember the only time I've had this happen was a week before someone died. I ignored my thoughts and summed it up as a coincidence. I went back to sleep. 1 week later, my stepmom died. I went without any night knocks until I was 28. Each knock gave off different vibes. These knocks were close together, and like a good friend, I was excited to visit. After these knocks, I broke down. I wanted to know who. I stayed up all night and asked, who? Over and over again. Thinking I was crazy but feeling desperate. I finally reached out to my family to tell them about all the knocks and that I knew in my heart that someone was trying to say goodbye. I finally got so tired that I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up with a hymn in my head. It was my step-grandpa's favorite hymn, Saints Keep Marching On. He and I hadn't talked since my stepmother died, but he meant the world to me in childhood. I was washed over with a happy and peaceful feeling. I immediately got hold of all of my family and told them about all the knocks. I asked them to check up on him because I didn't have his number and was halfway across the country. I was worried and tried sending him messages. I know I sounded crazy to my family at the time. It turns out he had just been diagnosed with terminal brain cancer 1 month prior. 1 week after the knocks, he peacefully died in his sleep. At 29, I heard 3 more knocks. I text all my family, everyone is good. No one is sick or traveling. I again ask, who is this? A happy, goofy sense of love comes by. Not a romantic love, but a bonded love. There was no song in my head when I woke up, but a sense of goofy humor. 1 week later, a dear man died. A man who was my best friend's dad and was like a second dad to me growing up. He had a very light-hearted sense of humor and loved pranks. Age 30. I wake up to 3 soft knocks. Once again, I find myself begging thin air, who? I refuse to go to sleep. I felt like I had to be awake. I was washed over with an unfamiliar motherly love that I could tell just wasn't for me. My mom lived close, and she was good. My stepmother was already gone, and so was my dad's mom. My mom's mother and I never met due to her being in prison my entire life. I wasn't close to another motherly figure. So I text my family again. My knocks are now becoming a family investigation, but when I talk to my mom, that feeling washes over me again. I tell her maybe it was her aunt who raised her. My mom called her aunt to check up on her, she was doing well. Every time I went near my mom after acknowledging those knocks, that feeling of abundant love just washed over me. It was so strong that it would put me in tears. My mom couldn't think of anyone either. 1 week after the knocks, my mom's mother died. My mom didn't think her mom ever loved her, and I swear, I felt the love she did have for my mom. I was just used to showing my mom through my tears of love how loved she always was. Age 31. I hear 2 loud knocks. Not 3. At this point, I would rather feel than hear or see. I feel hysteria, confusion, and shock, but not death. That next morning, I woke up with a childhood song in my head. I used to sing with my dad and sister. REO Speedwagon, time for me to fly. I contacted my dad first. He's good. I contacted my sister. She had just found out she was pregnant and had to have a tumor removed from her ovary while pregnant. She wasn't going to tell any of the family because she was so afraid of losing her baby due to the tumor and surgery. She was in bad distress. We talked for a few hours, she listened to the REO song, and we both got a good laugh because she said that song was exactly how she felt. She was very thankful, so I called to check in on her. She really needed to vent. Surgery went well, and she had a beautiful baby girl. This year, I heard 2 knocks again. I ask, who is it? I am filled with sadness and hopelessness. I don't see or hear anything. I contacted my family. Everyone is fine. A few days pass, and now it's 3 knocks. I am begging to know who again. I found nothing but a deep feeling of hopelessness. 1 week later, a friend committed suicide after losing custody of his kids. Several weeks ago, I heard 2 loud knocks. I do my routine. My family and I try to investigate, we are spread out from coast to coast. I came up with nothing. A little over 2 weeks ago, 2 knocks turned into 3. A part of my routine has been this inner begging of wanting to know who it is. I want to share all my heart with them, because by now I am realizing that this only happens when I have bonded with someone. I swear I heard a name in a dream. I reached out to my family, I thought I heard a name. This has never happened. I only made out that the beginning of the name was pronounced Ra. It was so faint in my sleep. The only name I could think of was Ryan. A little over a week ago, another childhood friend, whose families were very close, died. I do not know how and am too sad to ask how. His name was Roger. Everyone I've ever felt close to has been from my earlier life. I have never truly bonded with anyone outside of my childhood or teen years. There's a part of me that's scared to bond with others. Has anyone else experienced these knocks? Did death follow? I know I sound crazy. I really only speak to close family about it due to how crazy I sound. It still freaks my family out each time they receive a "I heard knocking" text from me.